I never belonged. That's the first thing I need you to understand about my story. From the moment I could form coherent thoughts, I knew I was different from everyone else in Thornwick Village. While the other children played in the sunlit meadows, laughing without a care, I found myself drawn to the edges of the forest, where the shadows grew thick and the light struggled to penetrate. While they feared the darkness, I felt something else entirely. A pull, a whisper, a sense of recognition that I couldn't explain and didn't dare voice. My name is Seraphine Ashwood, though most in the village simply called me the Strange One or that odd Ashwood girl. My parents had died when I was barely 5 years old, killed in what the town elders described as a random animal attack in the woods. I was raised by my aunt, a stern woman named Beatrice, who viewed my peculiarities with a mixture of fear and resentment. She never said it outright, but I could see it in her eyes every time I stared too long at the twilight or expressed fascination with the old stories about creatures that haunted the night. The villagers whispered about me. I heard the words they muttered when they thought I couldn't hear, saw the way mothers pulled their children closer when I walked past the marketplace. They said I had death in my eyes, that I carried the same darkness that had claimed my parents. But what they didn't understand, what they could never understand, was that the darkness wasn't something I carried. It was something I longed for, something that felt more like home than any four walls ever could. I was 19 when everything changed. 19 years of isolation, of being the outcast, of watching from the shadows as others lived their normal lives filled with normal dreams. I had accepted my fate by then, understanding that I would always be alone, always be the one who didn't quite fit into the tapestry of human existence. I had built walls around my heart so high that I thought nothing could breach them. I was wrong. It was a moonless night in late autumn when I first saw him. The kind of night that made most people bolt their doors and pray for sunrise. I had slipped out of my aunt's house after she fell asleep, as I often did, needing the solace that only the darkness could provide. The forest was my sanctuary, my escape from the judgmental stares and whispered insults. Among the ancient trees, I could breathe. I could be myself without apology or explanation. I was walking along one of the forgotten paths, the kind that hadn't been used in decades, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Not a sound of danger exactly, but something that shouldn't have been there. A labored breathing. A groan of pain. Something both human and utterly inhuman at the same time. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to run, to flee back to the safety of the village. But rationality had never been my strong suit, and curiosity had always been my fatal flaw. I moved toward the sound, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in short gasps. The shadows seemed to part from me as if they knew I belonged among them, as if they were welcoming me home. And then I saw him. He was slumped against an old oak tree, one hand pressed against his side, where dark blood seeped through his fingers. Even wounded, even clearly in agony, he was the most striking being I had ever laid eyes on. His features were sharp and aristocratic, carved from marble with an artist's precision. His hair was dark as a raven's wing, falling across a face that was too pale, too perfect, too otherworldly to be human. But it was his eyes that captured me, held me frozen in place with their intensity. They were silver. Not gray, not blue, but true silver, like moonlight given form and substance. They glowed faintly in the darkness, and when they focused on me, I felt as if every secret I had ever kept was being laid bare. Those eyes held centuries of experience, of pain, of loss, and beneath all of that, something I recognized immediately because I had carried it my entire life: loneliness. I should have known immediately what he was. The pallor of his skin, the unnatural grace even in his wounded state, the way the shadows seemed to cling to him like old friends. But my mind refused to accept what my eyes were showing me, refused to name what stood before me bleeding and beautiful and impossibly alive. He spoke first, his voice a low rasp that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. He told me to leave, to forget I had ever seen him, to run back to my safe little life and pretend this night had never happened. There was arrogance in his tone, yes, but also something else. Concern, perhaps. Or was it fear? Fear for me, not of me, but I didn't run. I couldn't. Instead, I knelt beside him, my hands trembling as I reached out to assess his wound. He flinched away from my touch, and for a moment, I saw something flash across his face. Surprise. Confusion. As if the simple act of human kindness was so foreign to him that he didn't know how to process it. He demanded to know what I was doing, his voice sharp with a mixture of pain and suspicion. I explained that I was trying to help him, that his wound looked serious and he needed medical attention. He laughed then, a bitter sound that held no warmth, and informed me that people like him didn't receive help from people like me. People like him were hunted, killed, burned to ash without mercy or hesitation. That's when the truth settled over me like a funeral shroud. I was kneeling beside a vampire, a creature of nightmare and legend, one of the beings that mothers used to frighten their children into obedience. The hunters who passed through Thornwick every few months were searching for creatures exactly like him, and they showed no mercy when they found them. The village elders preached that vampires were soulless monsters, demons wearing human skin, abominations that needed to be wiped from existence. But as I looked into those silver eyes, I didn't see a monster. I saw someone who was tired, someone who was hurting, someone who, like me, had spent their entire existence being told they didn't belong, that they were wrong, that they were something to be feared and rejected. I made a choice that night that would alter the entire course of my life. I tore strips from my dress and wrapped his wound as best I could, ignoring his protests and his warnings that I was making a terrible mistake. I told him about the old hunting cabin on the edge of my aunt's property, abandoned for years and forgotten by everyone except me. I explained that the hunters were combing the forest, that they wouldn't stop until they found him, that his only chance was to hide until he was strong enough to escape. He stared at me as if I had grown a second head, his expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been hope. He asked the question that would echo through my mind for months to come, the question that I still don't have a complete answer for even now. Why would I do this for him? I couldn't answer him. Not then. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? How could I put into words the recognition I felt? The sense that in saving him, I was somehow saving a part of myself. So I said nothing. I simply helped him to his feet, ignoring the way his cold skin made me shiver, and guided him through the forest to the cabin. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Small, dusty, filled with forgotten furniture and the ghosts of better times. I settled him on the old bed in the corner, brought water from the well outside, and did what I could to make him comfortable. He watched me the entire time with those unsettling silver eyes, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. Before I left, I promised to return the next night with proper supplies. He caught my wrist as I turned to go, his grip surprisingly gentle for someone with such obvious strength. He warned me that this was my last chance to walk away, that once I returned, once I committed to this path, there would be no going back. The hunters would kill me without hesitation if they discovered what I had done. My own people would condemn me as a traitor and a monster sympathizer. I met his gaze steadily and told him I would see him tomorrow night. His fingers released my wrists slowly, reluctantly, and I slipped back into the darkness, my mind reeling from what I had just done. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I went through the motions of my daily routine, helping my aunt with her chores, avoiding the villagers as much as possible, and trying not to think about the wounded vampire hiding in the cabin, but he was all I could think about. Those silver eyes haunted my every thought, and I found myself counting the hours until nightfall with an intensity that frightened me. I stole medical supplies from my aunt's collection, taking bandages and herbs that were supposed to have healing properties. I had no idea if they would work on a vampire, but it was better than nothing. I packed bread and dried meat as well, though I suspected he wouldn't need food in the traditional sense. Still, it felt important to bring something, to show that I was serious about helping him. As soon as darkness fell, I slipped out of the house and made my way to the cabin. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Part of me expected to find the cabin empty, to discover that the entire encounter had been some fever dream conjured by my lonely imagination. But he was there, exactly where I had left him, though he looked somewhat better than he had the night before. He seemed surprised to see me, as if he truly hadn't believed I would return. I set about changing his bandages, trying to ignore the unnatural coldness of his skin and the way his wound was already beginning to close. Vampire healing, I realized, faster than human, but not instantaneous. He would need time to recover fully. We didn't speak much that second night. The silence between us was thick with unasked questions and unspoken truths. But I felt something shifting, some invisible barrier beginning to crack. He wasn't looking at me with quite as much suspicion anymore, and the arrogance in his expression had softened into something more closely resembling curiosity. On the third night, he finally told me his name, Lysander Blackthorn. It was an old name, he explained, from a time when the world was different, and his kind walked more freely among humans. He had been born nearly 300 years ago, turned into a vampire against his will by a creature who saw his mortality as something to be stolen rather than respected. I shared my own story in return, though it felt almost laughable in comparison. 19 years of life versus 3 centuries of existence. But as I spoke about my isolation, about the rejection I had faced from my own people, about the strange pull I felt toward the darkness, I saw something change in his expression. Understanding. Recognition. The same thing I had felt when I first looked into his eyes. He explained that he understood loneliness in a way few could. For centuries he had wandered from place to place, never staying long enough to form connections, never allowing himself to care about anyone or anything. He had watched kingdoms rise and fall, seen human civilization transform beyond recognition, and through it all, he had been alone. Always alone. Because that was the nature of what he was. Vampires were solitary creatures by necessity, feared and hunted by the very beings they once were. Night after night, I returned to the cabin. What began as simple care for his wounds evolved into something far more complex. We talked for hours, sharing stories and secrets in the darkness. He told me about the places he had seen, the wonders and horrors of centuries of existence. I told him about my dreams and fears, about the person I wanted to be but could never become in Thornwick. Slowly, carefully, I began to see past the cold exterior he presented to the world. Beneath the arrogance and the ancient weariness, there was someone who was deeply, profoundly tired of being hated for something he never chose. Someone who had spent centuries being called a monster until he almost believed it himself. Someone who, like me, just wanted to be accepted for what he was rather than what others thought he should be. I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. The sound of his voice became something I craved, and the rare moments when he smiled made my heart do strange things in my chest. I told myself it was simple companionship, the natural result of 2 lonely souls finding each other in the darkness. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was falling in love with him. The realization terrified me. Everything I had been taught, everything I had grown up believing, told me that this was wrong. Humans and vampires were not meant to care for each other. We were supposed to be enemies, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. Love between us was not just forbidden. It was considered an abomination, a betrayal of the natural order itself. But my heart didn't care about what was forbidden or what was natural. It only knew that when I was with Lysander, I felt whole in a way I never had before. The emptiness that had plagued me my entire life seemed to fill with his presence, and the darkness that had always felt like home became warm and welcoming when he was in it. I think he felt it too, though he tried to hide it behind walls of stone and ice. I would catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between tenderness and torment. Sometimes, when I was changing his bandages, his hand would linger on mine a moment too long, his cold fingers intertwining with my warm ones in a gesture that spoke volumes without saying a word. 2 weeks into his recovery, everything came crashing down. I had been careless, too caught up in my secret visits and my growing feelings to pay proper attention to my surroundings. One of the village boys, a cruel youth named Marcus, who had made my childhood miserable with his taunts and tricks, followed me to the cabin one night. I didn't realize he was there until it was too late, until he had seen enough to understand exactly what I was doing. I returned to the village the next morning to find an angry mob gathered in the town square. Marcus stood at the center, his face flushed with righteous fury as he recounted what he had witnessed. He described how he had seen me entering the old cabin, how he had heard voices inside, how he had peeked through a crack in the walls and seen me tending to a creature of darkness. The villagers turned on me with a speed that stole my breath. These were people I had known my entire life. People who had watched me grow from a strange child into an even stranger young woman. And in an instant, every bit of tolerance they had shown me evaporated like morning mist. I was a traitor, a monster sympathizer, someone who had endangered the entire village by harboring one of the creatures that hunted in the night. My aunt stood among them, her face a mask of cold fury. She declared that she was ashamed to share blood with me, that my parents would be disgusted by what I had become. She informed the crowd that I was no longer welcome in her home, that I should be driven from the village like the filth I was. The village elders debated what to do with me. Some called for my immediate execution, claiming that anyone who aided a vampire was as guilty as the vampire itself. Others argued for banishment, saying that my blood would taint their soil if they killed me there. In the end, they decided to lock me in the old church cellar while they sent word to the hunters. Let the professionals decide my fate, they reasoned. Let those who specialized in dealing with darkness handle the dark-hearted girl who had betrayed them all. As they dragged me to the church, I caught a glimpse of the hunting party forming. They were heading to the cabin, armed with stakes and torches and holy water. They were going to kill Lysander, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I spent that day in absolute darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The cellar was cold and damp, smelling of mildew and decay. But worse than the physical discomfort was the knowledge that I had failed him. After everything he had endured, after 300 years of being hunted and hated, he would die because I had been too careless to cover my tracks properly. I expected the hunters to return with news of his death. I expected to hear them celebrating their victory, to listen as they described how the ancient vampire had finally been brought to justice. But hours passed and there was only silence. Night fell and still nothing. I pressed my ear against the cellar door, straining to hear any sound that might give me a clue about what was happening. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope entirely, I heard it. A voice I recognized, speaking with quiet urgency just outside the door. Lysander. He had come for me. Despite the danger, despite knowing that the village was on high alert and the hunters were everywhere, he had come. I heard the lock mechanism breaking, and then the door swung open to reveal him standing in the darkness, looking more alive and vital than I had ever seen him. He told me we needed to leave immediately, that the hunters had found the cabin empty and were searching the village. He explained that he had been planning to leave that very day anyway, to spare me the danger of continued association with him. But when he heard what had happened, when he learned that I had been imprisoned because of him, he couldn't bring himself to abandon me. I asked him why. Why would he risk himself for me when it would be so much easier and safer to simply disappear? He looked at me then with those silver eyes, and for the first time since I had known him, there was no mask, no pretense, no walls between us. He confessed that for 300 years, he had been merely existing, moving through the world like a ghost. But in the 2 weeks since I had saved him, since I had shown him kindness without expecting anything in return, he had felt something he thought was lost to him forever. He felt alive again. We fled into the forest, moving quickly through the familiar paths I had walked so many times before. But this time, everything was different. This time, I wasn't alone in the darkness. Lysander moved beside me with inhuman grace, guiding us away from the village and toward safety. He explained that he knew of places where we could hide, communities of outcasts and refugees who wouldn't ask too many questions about a vampire and his human companion. For a brief, beautiful moment, I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps we could build a life together somewhere far from Thornwick and its prejudices. Perhaps we could find a place where our forbidden love wouldn't matter, where we could simply exist as two beings who had found solace in each other's company. But hope, I was learning, was a dangerous thing. We had been traveling for 3 days when the hunters caught up to us. I don't know how they tracked us so quickly. Perhaps they had dogs trained to follow vampire scent. Perhaps they had their own supernatural means of hunting. All I knew was that one moment we were making our way through a mountain pass, and the next we were surrounded by armed men with murder in their eyes. There were at least a dozen of them, each one carrying weapons specifically designed to kill vampires. Silver-tipped arrows, stakes carved from blessed wood, vials of holy water that would burn like acid. And leading them was the most feared vampire hunter in the region, a man named Aldrich Cross who had dedicated his entire life to exterminating what he called the plague of the undead. Lysander pushed me behind him immediately, positioning himself between the hunters and me. Aldrich sneered at this display of protection and mocked him for trying to play hero. He announced that they would kill Lysander at dawn, as tradition dictated. They would stake him down and let the first rays of sunlight burn him to ash. And then they would deal with me, the traitorous human who had chosen darkness over light. They separated us, binding Lysander with silver chains that burned his flesh and locking me in an iron cage. I screamed and fought, but it was useless. These men had been hunting vampires for years. It knew how to contain both the undead and their sympathizers. That night was the longest of my life. I could see Lysander bound to a wooden post, his silver eyes never leaving mine even as the chains continued to burn him. The hunters made camp and celebrated their successful hunt, drinking and laughing and discussing in graphic detail exactly how they planned to end him. I worked at the lock on my cage all night, using a piece of broken metal I found on the ground. My fingers were bleeding and raw, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get to him somehow. I had to save him the way he had saved me. Just before dawn, I finally managed to force the lock open. The hunters were all sleeping, exhausted from their celebration and confident that their prisoners were secure. I crept toward Lysander, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would wake them all. But somehow, miraculously, I reached him without being discovered. His eyes widened when he saw me free. He whispered urgently that I needed to run, to escape while I still could, that there was no way to break his silver chains without the key that Aldrich kept around his neck. I told him I wasn't leaving without him. He insisted, almost begged me to save myself. He explained that dawn was only minutes away, that even if I could free him, we would never make it to shelter in time. I remember looking into those silver eyes, seeing the acceptance of his fate written across his ancient features. He had lived for 3 centuries, and now he was ready to die. But I wasn't ready to let him go. I couldn't be. Not when I had finally found someone who understood me, who accepted me, who made me feel like I belonged in the world. I told him that they had already killed me when they tore me away from him. Whatever happened next didn't matter because a life without him in it wasn't a life worth living anyway. He started to protest, but I silenced him by pressing my lips to his in our first and only kiss. It was cold and warm at the same time, sweet and bitter. A perfect crystallization of everything we were and everything we could never be. That's when the hunters woke up. They saw me with Lysander, saw the evidence of my escape, and erupted into chaos. Uldric roared orders, demanding that his men recapture me immediately, but I had no intention of being captured again. I grabbed one of their discarded weapons and stood between them and Lysander, prepared to fight even though I knew I couldn't win. Uldric found my defiance amusing. He approached slowly, his own weapon drawn, and explained that he would make sure my death was slow and painful as a lesson to anyone else who thought to side with the creatures of darkness. He raised his sword, and I closed my eyes, ready to accept my fate. But the blow never came. I opened my eyes to find Lysander standing before me, his silver chains shattered on the ground around him. I learned later that he had used the last of his supernatural strength to break free, knowing that it would leave him vulnerable and weak. He had positioned himself between me and Uldric's blade, taking the strike that was meant for me. The sword pierced his chest, missing his heart by mere inches, but inflicting terrible damage nonetheless. He staggered but didn't fall, his arms wrapping around me protectively even as his blood stained my dress. The hunters moved to strike again, but then something happened that stopped them all in their tracks. The sun began to rise. I felt Lysander tense in my arms as the first rays of light touched the horizon. The hunters stepped back, lowering their weapons, content to let nature finish what they had started. Vampires and sunlight were incompatible. Everyone knew that. The sun would reduce him to ash within seconds, and their work would be done. Lysander tried to push me away one last time, pleading with me to let him face this alone, but I held on tighter, my tears falling freely now. I repeated what I had told him earlier, that they had already taken everything from me, that without him, I had nothing left to lose. The sunlight grew stronger, spreading across the mountain pass like a golden tide. I braced myself for the moment when Lysander would begin to burn, trying to be strong for him even as my heart was shattering into a million pieces. But he surprised me one final time. Instead of trying to save himself, instead of fleeing into whatever shadows remained, he turned to face the sun. And then he did something that I will remember for the rest of my days. He smiled at me, a real, genuine smile that reached his silver eyes and made them shine like starlight. He told me that 300 years of darkness had been worth it for just 2 weeks of feeling truly alive. And then he stepped into the direct sunlight, placing himself completely between me and the hunters who still posed a threat. The moment the sun touched his skin, he began to burn. Not with fire exactly, but with light. He was glowing, incandescent, beautiful, even in his destruction. Smoke rose from his form as the UV rays began breaking down his undead flesh at a molecular level. I screamed his name, trying to reach him, but he had used his last strength to push me back into the shade of a nearby overhang. He was protecting me even as he died, ensuring that I would survive even if he couldn't. The hunters, so focused on the spectacle of his death, had forgotten about me entirely. I watched, helpless and heartbroken, as the vampire who had taught me what it meant to be accepted disintegrated before my eyes. His form grew more translucent with each passing second, the light consuming him from the inside out. But through it all, he never looked away from me. Those silver eyes held mine until the very end. And then, just before he vanished completely, he raised one hand toward me. Not a wave, not a farewell gesture, but a deliberate movement of his finger across his palm. I felt a sudden sharp pain on my own wrist and looked down to see a thin line of blood welling up as if he had touched me with an invisible blade. It was the last thing he ever did. A final gift, a mark that connected us even beyond death. And then Lysander Blackthorn, who had survived 3 centuries of hatred and persecution, who had faced countless battles and emerged victorious, who had seen empires rise and fall, crumbled into ash and was carried away on the morning breeze. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hunters seemed shaken by what they had witnessed. They had seen vampires die before, but never like that. Never with such willing sacrifice. Never with such evident love. Eldrick was the first to recover. He approached me slowly, his expression unreadable. I expected him to kill me, to finish what he had started. I was too numb to care anymore. But instead, he stared at the cut on my wrist, at the blood that wouldn't stop flowing, and something changed in his eyes. He told me to leave, just like that, without explanation or condition. He ordered his men to stand down, to let me go, to pretend they had never seen me. One of the hunters protested, demanding justice for my betrayal of humanity. But Aldrich silenced him with a look and repeated his command. Later, much later, I learned that Aldrich had a daughter once. A daughter who had died defending a vampire she loved, killed by her own father before he understood what he was doing. He had spent years trying to justify his actions, telling himself that she had been corrupted, that the vampire had twisted her mind. But watching Lysander sacrifice himself for me had shattered that comfortable lie. He had seen what I saw. Evidence that vampires could love just as deeply and truly as humans could. I stumbled away from that mountain pass in a daze, my wrist still bleeding, my heart still breaking. I had nowhere to go, no home to return to, no family to comfort me. I was truly alone now, more alone than I had ever been even in my most isolated moments in Thornwick. But I wasn't completely alone. I had the mark on my wrist, the cut that refused to heal, that bled a single drop every dawn. And as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, I began to understand what Lysander had given me. The mark wasn't just a scar or a reminder. It was a bond, a connection that transcended death itself. Every morning when the sun rose, the wound would bleed and then seal itself again. And in that moment, just for a heartbeat, I could feel him. Not a ghost or a spirit, but an echo of what we had shared. A proof that what we felt for each other had been real and powerful enough to leave an impression on reality itself. I eventually found a new place to live, a small town on the coast where nobody knew my story and nobody asked too many questions. I took a job at a library, surrounded myself with books and knowledge, and tried to build some semblance of a normal life. But I never forgot him. How could I? He had shown me that love wasn't about sameness or similarity. It was about recognition and acceptance. It was about seeing someone completely and loving them not despite their darkness, but because of it. People in my new town noticed the mark on my wrist, of course. They commented on it, asked if I had tried various remedies to make it heal properly. I always smiled and told them it was an old wound that never quite closed right. Nothing to worry about. I never told them the truth. How could I explain that I wore the mark of a vampire's love, that every sunrise brought me both pain and comfort? Years passed. I remained alone, never seeking another relationship because nothing could compare to what I had shared with Lysander. People called me strange again, whispered about the lonely librarian who watched the sunrise every morning with tears in her eyes. But their whispers didn't hurt anymore. I had learned that being different wasn't something to fear or apologize for. It was simply who I was, and that was enough. I'm older now, my hair showing its first streaks of gray, my face bearing the lines of a life fully lived. The mark on my wrist has never faded, never changed. It remains as vivid and fresh as it was the day Lysander gave it to me. And every dawn, without fail, it bleeds and shines with a faint silver light that reminds me of his eyes. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I find myself speaking to him. I tell him about my day, share my thoughts and fears, describe the beauty of the sunrises I've witnessed since he left. I like to think he can hear me somehow, that the connection between us remains strong enough to carry my words across whatever divide separates the living from the dead. People ask me sometimes if I regret what happened. They want to know if I wish I had never saved him that night in the forest, if I think my life would have been easier if I had simply walked away and left him to the hunters. And my answer is always the same: no. 1,000 times, no. Yes, our time together was brief. Yes, it ended in tragedy and loss. Yes, I have spent years carrying the weight of that grief. But those 2 weeks with Lysander were worth more than a lifetime of safety and normalcy. He taught me what it meant to be truly seen, truly accepted, truly loved. He showed me that connection was possible even between beings who were supposed to be enemies. He proved that love could exist in the darkest places and shine brighter than any sun. The world says that vampires don't have souls, that they're incapable of genuine emotion or connection. The world says that what Lysander and I shared was wrong, unnatural, an aberration that deserved to be destroyed. But the world doesn't understand what I know, what I learned in those precious days we had together. Love isn't determined by what you are, it's determined by who you choose to be. And Lysander, in choosing to save me at the cost of his own existence, proved that he had more soul than most humans I've ever known. So I carry his mark with pride. I wear it as a badge of honor, a symbol of a love that was pure and true and powerful enough to transcend every law and boundary that society tried to impose upon us. And every morning when I watch the sunrise, when I feel that familiar pain and see that silver glow, I remember a vampire with silver eyes who taught me that darkness wasn't something to fear. I remember his smile in those final moments, the way he faced death without regret because he had finally known what it meant to be loved. I remember his sacrifice, the way he gave up everything so that I could live, so that I could tell this story, so that someone, somewhere, might understand that love knows no boundaries. They say vampires don't love. They say creatures of darkness have no capacity for genuine emotion, that they're hollow things wearing human faces, that any affection they show is merely manipulation or mockery of real feeling. But if that's true, then what was it that made Lysander break free from those silver chains, even though doing so left him defenseless? What was it that made him position himself between me and certain death? What was it that made him willingly step into sunlight, embracing his own destruction to ensure my survival? If vampires can't love, then what was it I saw in his eyes every time he looked at me? If creatures of darkness have no souls, then what was it that connected us so profoundly that it left a permanent mark that transcends mortality itself? I know what it was. I know what I felt in those final moments as he turned to ash. I know what I feel every time my wrist bleeds at dawn. I know what lives on in the connection that death couldn't sever. It was love. Real, genuine, absolute love. The kind that sees past differences and prejudices. The kind that accepts darkness as part of the whole rather than something to be feared or destroyed. The kind that values connection over conformity, understanding over judgment, sacrifice over self-preservation. So let the world say what it will. Let them claim that vampires are monsters incapable of love. Let them insist that what Lysander and I shared was wrong or impossible or a delusion. I know the truth. I carry the proof of it on my wrist, feel the evidence of it in my heart. See the reality of it every time the sun rises, and I'm reminded that he chose me over his own existence. That's my story. The story of Seraphine Ashwood, the strange girl from Thornwick who fell in love with a vampire and learned that belonging isn't about being the same as everyone else. It's about finding someone who sees your darkness and loves you, not despite it, but because it's part of what makes you whole. I still don't fully belong anywhere. I'm still the outsider, still the one who doesn't quite fit in normal society. But now I understand that's okay, because for a brief, shining moment, I belonged with him. And that was enough. That will always be enough. The mark on my wrist has just begun to glow again. Dawn is coming. And as I watch the first rays of sunlight paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I touch the scar and whisper the same words I've whispered every morning for the past 15 years. Thank you, Lysander. Thank you for showing me that love exists even in the deepest darkness. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for proving that acceptance and belonging aren't about conforming to what others expect, but about finding someone who cherishes exactly who you are. Thank you for loving me. The sun rises, the mark bleeds and glows, and I feel him. Just for a moment, just for a heartbeat, I feel the echo of what we were and what we will always be to each other. Connected, recognized, loved, and in that moment, I'm not alone anymore. I never was. Because love, true love, doesn't die when the body turns to ash. It lives on in the hearts it touched, in the marks it left, in the memories that refuse to fade. They say vampires don't love, but I know better. And now, so do you.